I have a really interesting article here that I want to share with you that was written in 1962. And just reading this article really gives me a highly claustrophobic feeling, and you'll see why in a few moments. The article was titled World's Record Ship Salvage, and I'm sure the methodology for such a thing has improved since this article was written, and the actual event itself happened in 1958. So the article is really lengthy, and I'm only going to read a portion of it to you, but I think you'll find it interesting. On a December night of sudden squalls and unpredictable glimpses of stars, this remarkable true story of the sea begins. The scene was an arm of Puget Sound, the East Passage, between Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. The year was 1958, and the vessel was the Cape Douglas, a diesel-powered 78-footer. She was headed for the bottom and a major role in a drama that would combine high technical skill, cool feats of daring, and courtroom conflict over a rare crime. Skipper and chief owner of the Cape Douglas was a toil-aged young man of 28 years, blue-eyed, sandy-haired, son of generations of Norwegian seafaring men. His name was Odd John Solnerdal. Odd in honor of the Norse god Odin, John to please his mother. He had a quick boyish grin for the fleeting fun of life, but normally his pale, sad face was set in a mask of wistful disappointment. One shoulder on his lean body was hunched for all time against heavy burdens assumed far too young. He had gone to sea over 14 times. Now at this moment, 3 nights after Christmas, he was leaning over the boat's wheel, peering morosely into the dark. The only other man on board the Cape Douglas that evening was the engineer, Kenneth Ness, a burly fellow twice Odd's size. No more were needed, because for the boat was on a housekeeping errand, and she was bound for a shipyard to have a new winch installed. And it was nearly time for Ness to take his turn at the wheel, and he sleepily emerged from the cabin. With a brief word about getting something to eat, Odd left the engineer in charge and went below. A little while later, he was back. "Go get yourself some grub, Kenny," he said. "Ness will be willing enough." He relinquished the wheel and headed for the little galley. Suddenly, the big engineer reappeared. "Hey," he shouted, "what's wrong with the boat?" She seemed to be staggering. Ness lurched off below deck to check the steering machinery. He returned in a dash. "The engine room's full of water," he yelled. "We're sinking." It was obvious that he was right. The Cape Douglas stumbled and began to bury her nose in the water, and the 2 men scrambled away in her rubber life raft. Some 50 yards off, they stopped paddling for a few odd moments to watch the big fishing vessel slide out of sight. When she sank, they were sure no man would ever see her again. The water there, a little more than a mile offshore, was many hundreds of feet deep. They headed for Three Tree Point on the mainland, and around midnight, soaked by another squall, they pounded on the door of a home on the point, and the owner took them in and lent them dry clothes. The next morning, Odd told reporters and a Coast Guard officer that the Cape Douglas had struck a submerged object. It had been something that felt very heavy, like metal, he explained. After colliding with it, the boat sank rapidly, he said. A woman who had read the newspaper accounts telephoned later to say she thought she knew what the Cape Douglas had hit, a torn and jagged metal float that had been moored to the beach outside her cottage on the Sound, but had disappeared in a recent storm. In the weeks and months that followed, Odd retold the story of the sinking to insurance investigators and to the FBI, and then an extraordinary feat of salvage led to a dramatic revelation of what had really happened to the Cape Douglas. And now, the salvage operations. The unique recovery effort began early in January 1959, and it started with an almost casual flight by a small float plane. The pilot worked for the U.S. Salvage Association, and it was the duty of that organization, acting for insurance underwriters, to locate the sunken Cape Douglas and find out if it could be raised. Odd had insured the boat for $80,000 a few weeks before it was sunk, and had since put a claim in for that full amount. The plane pilot that morning had intended just to practice landings. His boss, however, asked him if he'd fly around near where the Cape Douglas had sunk and see if he could spot an oil slick on the water. And he found one all right. Curiously, it appeared to be quite away from where it was expected. 2 or 3 days later, the pilot flew back. This time, he landed beside the oil slick and saw that it was bubbling up from below. He fixed its position nearly 5 miles south of where Odd John had said his craft had sunk. Not long afterward, the jaunty little Nepper, a boat belonging to Minneapolis Honeywell's Seattle Development Laboratory, nosed up to the oily stain on the surface of the East Passage. The Nepper is used to test special marine electronic devices, and she is not normally for hire, but the U.S. Salvage Association had successfully negotiated for her help. Aboard the Nepper was an ingenious apparatus called a sea scanner. It's a kind of underwater radar, playing a narrow beam of high-frequency sound through the depths like a searchlight, and the sea scanner catches echoes from objects that intercept the beam. The echoes are amplified and can be both seen and heard. They appear on a scope as tiny blips of greenish-white light, which paint a brief outline of whatever reflects the pulses. At the same time, over a speaker, come curious but distinctive noises which help to identify the object. Mud, for instance, returns a rough scratching sound. Metal or rock produces a sonar thump that is like a rap on a muffled drumhead. Now, with the sea scanner's magical help, the Nepper found a boat-shaped object below the cloud of surface oil, though far, far below. Scanned from side to side, there was the unmistakable silhouette of a fishing vessel, that is, of the Cape Douglas's class, with superstructure far forward. Dismayingly, it was 666 feet down. No man in a diving suit could be lowered more than half that depth, without the risk of being crushed to death by the enormous pressure of the water. Yet unless a diver could reach this object, it could not be positively identified. And supposing it was the Cape Douglas, was it too badly damaged to be worth salvaging? Only a diver who could look closely at the hull could answer that question. And even if the damage were not severe, how could the vessel possibly be raised? No one in the large community of sea-wise men around Seattle had ever heard of a successful salvage job from anything like that crushing depth. The Nepper, meanwhile, had anchored a buoy to the deep-drowned hull and gone home. Officials of the U.S. Salvage Association regarded the buoy as its connected problems in perplexity. It was then that a seasoned Seattle diver and salvager named Leiter Hockett stepped forward. He offered a weird solution to the initial puzzle of how to identify and inspect the boat that lay so far out of reach. He offered to let down at that site in a homemade diving chamber, which he had built 8 years before. Some people said the object looked more like an eccentric oil drum than anything else, and actually its corrugated steel shell, 9 feet long and around 30 inches across, had been the firebox flue inside a Scotch marine boiler. It had been made to withstand external pressure of as much as 450 pounds per square inch, or psi, and Hockett figured that this was roughly equivalent to the pressure of the water at the depth of 1,000 feet. So he had decided to convert the boiler flue into a diving chamber. The result was a strange-looking and obviously dangerous craft, but it worked so far. Hockett had stood the cylinder on end and cut a belt of 9 small round holes at eye level in the folds of its steel skin. He had filled the holes with laminated shock-resistant glass 4.5 inches in diameter and 1 5/8 inches thick. The windows were tilted slightly downward so he could see below when he was in the chamber. The cylinder had an inside diameter of only 27 inches. Hockett got in and out through an oval hatch so small that it seemed impossible for his square body and massive shoulders to squeeze through. And as it was, when he was ready to make a descent in the diving chamber, he had to toss his fleece-lined jacket and trousers through the hatch, wriggle after them in his underwear, and put them on inside. The weight of the chamber properly, the weight the chamber properly. Excuse me, folks. I'm sorry. To weight the chamber properly, he had filled the bottom with a half-ton of cement and steel, and covered the foot-high heap of ballast with a floor plate. Okay, now here's where it gets a little bit claustrophobic. Fair warning. Once the hatch cover was closed above him, like the door of a tomb, it was bolted and barred from outside. His only connections with the surface while underwater were a two-way telephone and a supporting wire cable. They were paid out by a 90-horsepower engine on a floating crane that lowered and raised his chamber as if it were a plumb bob. When the hatch clanged shut, Hockett donned an Air Force breathing mask and began to inhale pure oxygen from a tank in the chamber. Soda lime containers absorbed the carbon dioxide he exhaled, and the chief hazard was the slow rise in atmospheric pressure. Within the tiny, sealed chamber, it went up at a rate of 3 pounds an hour. The safe limit was a rise of 15 pounds, so he could not stay below more than 5 hours. It was this outfit, together with his services, that Hockett now invited the U.S. Salvage Association to hire for probing the dark waters beneath its marker buoy in the East Passage. With large doubts about his safety, but at a loss for an alternative method, the association gave him a try. On a February day, Hockett made his first descent, and it was an eerie journey through a world that steadily darkened and chilled as he sank through it. It would have been wholly silent, too, had the telephone line not been cackling with the banter of the carefree men on the crane. Two 1,000-watt floodlights attached to a bracket on a wire rope 15 feet above the diving chamber spread a diffused light through the crowding gloom as he dropped down deeper and deeper by the buoy's anchor line. The water was full of sediment, and a storm of small black particles whirled above the windows of his chamber. He was down for a full 5 hours and could find nothing. The next day, the Nepper was persuaded to return. Its sea scanner guided Hockett's second descent so exactly that at the end of 10 minutes slow fall, he found himself dangling within a foot of the sunken boat's mast. For 4 hours he was maneuvered around the hull like a leaden puppet, searching for identifying details and checking on the boat's condition. All this time, the weight of water on just the small top of his diving chamber was 250 tons, and he estimated afterwards, and even 300 feet above him, an empty oxygen tank that was one of the floats attached to the wire rope to make it lighter to handle had already been crushed flat by the pressure. But Hockett, swinging gently at the bottom of the long rope, worked imperturbably in his steel capsule. With hands in pockets to keep them warm, he peered through his windows into the dimly lighted murk. He could see point after point that indicated the hulk before his eyes was actually that of the Cape Douglas. He could find no sign of damage to her hull, though, which rested heavily in very soft mud. Now, throughout the slow, cautious inspection, his entire conversation with the man on the floating crane was recorded there on magnetic tape for possible use in court. At last the job was done, and Hockett asked to be hauled up, and then came some heart-stopping moments. The diving chamber tangled in the small boat's rigging like a fishhook snagged on a submerged limb. Several times the crane slacked and reeled in again, but it didn't help. Finally, Hockett urged the crew on the crane to bust him loose by tugging harder. There was a terrifying chance that the diving chamber would be torn from its rope, and this would plunge Hockett into oblivion in billowy mud. Lost beneath its obscuring coat, he would slowly suffocate in darkness and silence. But under a 3 or 4 ton pull, the old boiler flue suddenly lurched upward, shedding fragments of rigging as it soared, and the crane platform wallowed at the abrupt release of the strain, and Hockett bobbed wildly for a few dizzy instants in the distant depths before the ascent could become calm and steady once more. As Hackett's chamber neared the surface, he opened a valve to bubble off excess pressure before his hatch was opened, and congratulated himself on an historic achievement. He was given an enthusiastic welcome by the relieved men aboard the crane, and the position of the Cape Douglas was then carefully recorded so that the marker buoy could be removed from the path of other vessels. But the major task, perhaps impossible, of recovering the sunken boat from its deep grave still lay ahead. With more reason now than ever before to suspect Odd's story of the sinking, the insurance companies had not yet paid his claim, but should they spend a great deal more than they already had to find out for certain whether or not the man was lying. And I'm going to end the article there because that deals with the part that interested me the most, and I hope was an interest to you. And, I won't advise thinking too long of what it was like in the chamber. It makes me feel kind of queasy. They're alone in the dark. Maybe 250, 300 tons of pressure above you had already smashed flat one of the oxygen tanks. Anyways, I hope that you found the article interesting. And if you did, please subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Be sure to check out my playlist, where there are now over 8,000 videos available for your consideration. God bless and have a great day.